Pharmacology Research Group, which I'm going to give some background about later on. The presentation of today is about risk management, so it's a sort of an introduction about what it is and what it is for. But as I promised, the first thing that I'd like to say a few words about is the place where we are. So the research group where we are is a multidisciplinary research group that initially started to highlight issue in relation to human factors in aerospace. So it has played a leading role in developing human factors research within the European 4th, 5th, and 6th and 7th framework programs. And now currently we've been involved in many research projects around performance management in risk and safety management. So that's why we're able to provide you like a sort of an introduction to this topic. As I said, the aim of the seminar is to give you the fundamental criteria, an idea of the methodological approaches for the identification of hazard, assessment of risk, and the principle of risk management in the workplace. The reason for that is I thought it was going to be useful to give you some background on why this seems to be a hot topic. As you know, I mean, in aviation, aviation is a very, very safe industry. But even in this safe industry, recently we have a major accident that occurred and has been a drawback, even for companies that have a very, let's say, clean safety record like Air France, and very good, let's say, approaches to risk management. Nevertheless, risk management is something that can never be put aside and can never be just paper-based. The reason for that is in front of everyone. So if you think about the Air France flight, the accident in June 2009, where the Airbus flying from Rio to Paris crashed in the Atlantic Ocean. And the aftermath of the accident investigation and the main antecedents that brought to that highlighted some pitfalls in the way risk was managed within Air France as well. Or another big example is even for BP, who is a company in the process industry, so a different industrial sector where safety is paramount. Safety is heavily regulated also. As you all remember, probably in 2010 we had the worst oil spill in history in Deepwater Horizon. So before we move any forward, I want to give you a definition of risk. That's because I think it's useful to start from basic. So I think there is a clear distinction, but I just want to highlight it again, between hazard and risk. So the hazard are the event that have the potential to pose a danger to people or to the environment or to organizations. And they are the ones that need to be identified. But when you actually have to think about risk and assess risk, risk is the combination of the likelihood of the scenario that can result from those hazards, which imply the type of consequence that those hazards can lead to. And as you know, basically for an organization, the totality of the scenarios that are relevant, that pose a risk or a danger to people, those scenarios need to be assessed in terms of the likelihood of their being in action and the severity of their consequences. So without the severity of the consequences, there's no definition or no assessment of risk. So the risk assessment is the core of risk management. So without knowing what you have to do or what are the risks you're facing, there is no way you can manage them. So that's why risk assessment is paramount in this context. And it's considered to be a careful examination of what could cause harm or loss. So that basically it's possible to make, when you do this examination, when you do this evaluation in the reference that we put forward earlier on, you can basically be able to evaluate or do a cost-benefit of analysis of whether you have taken enough precautions or not. So harm or loss are the same concept that apply to two different things. So harm is the adverse effect on people, on individuals, while loss is damage to property or equipment or in general economic consequence. As I said at the beginning, I'd like to give you some background also on the legal frameworks that are driving the driving force behind the risk management in industry. So there is something that we all have in common, which is the Directive on Safety Health Work. As you all know, this framework directive in 1981 was a Council directive aimed at introducing measures to encourage improvements in the safety and health of workers at work, and contain 9 general principles. It basically applies to everything that has to do with organizing workforces. That's why it's one of the most widely applied, and that's why it's contain 9 general principles that are very wide. So, as you've probably already seen, the first principle is the avoidance of risk if at all possible. And for certain industry, it's unavoidable, like in the process industry, in aviation. That's why they're more safety aware. And then the evaluation of those unavoidable risks, and see whether it's possible to avoid the source of those risks, or to put in place some countermeasure that can minimize their likelihood of their effects. However, in those contexts where risk is unavoidable and it's part of the business, risk acceptability criteria have been put in place. That's because risk perception, or the emotional carryover of what comes with fear of certain adverse consequences, can prevent certain industrial necessary application to take place. So we probably all remember, well, we remember many of the nuclear accidents, like the most, the one that probably comes to mind is Chernobyl. Following that accident in Italy, for instance, the nuclear plants that were open were decided to be closed by a referendum. In America, to avoid this type of like emotional outbursts to take over certain considerations, they applied from 1967, so well before that, a set of criteria to decide whether industrial activities were in the acceptable region or not. This is known as the FN curve, and you probably have seen some form of that. Again, is based on the definition of risk that we've seen earlier, so the number of equivalent injury, or if you like, the severity of consequence in terms of number of equivalent injury, it's on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we find the frequency of those events that can lead to those accidents. So only the activities that are in the acceptable region or in the tolerable region, provided that certain countermeasures are in place, are the ones deemed to be accepted by, for instance, national states authorities. In aviation, there is a special, as you know, aviation has been particularly safety aware. So the main reference point, although the EU regulation that I previously showed apply to aviation as well, the main reference point for aviation safety management system, and therefore risk management, is the ICAO manual. And in the ICAO manual, the people that have drafted that manual take into account the fact that ideally operations should be perfect. And we know that every organization will probably strive to have safety as baseline performance as perfect as possible. However, there is a practical drift that happens because not everything can actually be perfect all the time. And because of this, we know, and we have to just take into account the fact that this drift has to be in the acceptable region, let's say. Now, in order to do that, they propose 3 main the so-called navigation aids. So 3 main principles that, when followed, ensure that a company will keep this practical drift within controls. So the reactive, proactive, and predictive navigation aids, what are they? So the reactive aids are the one that we mostly know as response to accident. So they require a serious triggering events in order to take place, and they, let's say, It's like an accident occurs and then you have an investigation following. And in that investigation, you try to identify the causes that led to that accident and put something in place to avoid those causes from occurring again or from having that same effect. In the proactive area, we have something a little bit more advanced, which means you don't require a very serious event to take place, but you have something in the organization able to deal with every event, so that you can take into account all the possible causes or antecedents that can basically compromise your safety levels or compromise your performance. In the predictive area, we find those that are more advanced. So you do not require any triggering at all. You're able to analyze your routine operation data and continually capture or continually take stock of all the things that can, in some form or another, indicate an emergency safety issue. And therefore, you take proactive measure in respect to those. Now, this is our main reference point. However, I want to mention that for all industrial sectors, there's a new standard coming on called the ISO 31000. And for that standard, this is a standard that is going to be in common with all the industrial sectors. And in that standard, they really state the principles, the framework, and the process for risk management. That's the scope of the standard. That's how important it's going to be. It's going to be the new, it's probably going to have the same effect that the ISO 91000 had for quality management. The main principles they state in that standards, and the main principle that in some form or another you find also in the KO manual and in the Service Directive, for instance, for the process industry, is the principle that the first and foremost, a risk management structure within a company aims at creating value, and not just in avoiding loss, but also in improving, continuously improving what performance takes place within the company. Therefore, it needs to be an integral part of the way the organization is managed and not something set aside as a contingency plan just for emergency scenarios. And it needs to be part of decision making. And to take explicitly into account uncertainty, because when we talk about risk, as we said, likelihood is an interim part of their evaluation. So the cost-benefit analysis has to be compared with cost or losses that are likely to happen, which means they're not certain they can occur. As you see in the process, it takes into account establishing the context, the risk identification, the analysis, the evaluation, and the treatment of that, all in the context of a continuous monitoring and review and a communication and consultation with the main workforce in the field. I want to give you some examples. Basically, all this presentation up to now has been pretty much theoretical. I want to give you now some examples of practical application that we've seen in the industry, like best practices, and I'm taking them from MASCA. Now, in the MASCA cases, there are mainly two companies. Hello? Hello? Okay.
Can you still hear Chiara?
Can you still hear Chiara?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so in the managing, in the MASCA project, MASCA is a project funded by the 7th Framework Program in the European Commission, and is about managing system change in aviation. Two organizational changes, two case studies that we've been able to follow within the projects. One was for a major Swedish airline, and Pernilla Olfinger, my colleague from KTH, has been presenting some aspect of it in our previous seminars. And another case study was really a small regional airport, for which the need of establishing a safety management system according to the care regulation came to the fore, and we had to help that out. And we're just going to show some example of what we did for that. So the change initiative that we're going to talk about at the moment in the area of performance management in safety. What do we mean by performance management in MASCA and therefore performance management in safety? We mean 3 simple steps. There are, if you like, a way of restructuring the ISO framework that we previously showed. So the first element, before you actually even go into the risk analysis, is to map out what you actually do. It's impossible to do risk assessment properly unless it's well grounded on an understanding of the main process and activities that a company carry out. We have seen risk assessment in the industry being taken as a checklist of taking a list of all the possible hazards and see which one of them apply to our reality. That is not the way to go, because the first and foremost input to a proper risk assessment is a process analysis, or a so-called functional analysis. Anyway, a real deep understanding of what we do, or the series of activities that we carry out. And from that understanding follows the risk analysis. But risk analysis also can be input from the operational report and the data. So not only considering the data coming from accident reporting, but all the multiple variety of data that are incoming within an organization can potentially provide information useful to safety issue identification. So the data trending has to be considered in respect to this variety of data, not just the one that we can pigeonhole into the safety report. Anyway, however, so the understanding of how a system works, the understanding of what it is doing and what are the risks involved in the activities, and then basically the part where we actually, in following the evaluation of risk, we identify what countermeasure, what safety barriers, what can we put in place to minimize those risks, minimize the likelihood of a scenario from occurring or minimize the consequences, and evaluating how effective those countermeasures are over time is the key aspect to change in positive terms. So in SIS, and Pernilla would be more capable than me in reporting on this case study, the basic principle of performance management is well advanced according to the KO manual. And they also have a system for capturing data from different sources in the various operational area, able to be then collected within these databases of safety performance indicators. So they're based on the capability of the organization to determine what are the main safety factors the organization needs to monitor, and determine what available information is already out there that can feed into that. And then organize that information also in order to capture or identify what are the influencing factors and determine their importance, so that the information can be displayed for decision maker in a way that makes sense to them. However, even in that case study, at the beginning of the case, we identified it's really best practice already, it is, but what is still missing from it? And that's a question that I want all of you to ask yourself. What we found that was missing is that unless you know what are the possible antecedents of certain safety outcomes that are measured, even if you measure when those outcomes are out of range or are behaving in a way that you would like to see, there's very little you can do, very little heuristic you can apply unless you actually know what are the main leverage behind them that you can change. So therefore, it's paramount to be able to map those antecedents and monitor those as well. And then the other aspect is that unless we evaluate the interventions, we keep repeating maybe the same interventions even though they are most ineffective. Like, for instance, I've seen many times training being proposed as a countermeasure for a safety accident, and then with very little evaluation on the side effect of whether it was effective in preventing it from happening again or not. So evaluation has to be inherently part of this measurement of performance. Within MASCA, we probably propose as a way of organizing the mapping of the process that can also be used as a way of identifying source of antecedents of vulnerability. So you've probably already been presented by Nick the SCOPE framework. SCOPE stands is an acronym for supply, context, process, effects, and organizing. And really is just the way you can represent a process mainly, and the main critical aspects of it stands around those concepts. So you want to map out all the activities that are in the process area and identify what effects you're supposed to lead to and what KPI are connected to those effects. Identify the main input to those processes in terms of people, information, material, the context conditions that lead to those effects or to possible deviations from those effects, and the organizing elements that contribute to that, like the elements of coordination and leadership and automation that are important. And if not there, or if deviating from the expected status, can lead to deviations as well again. So this is an example of some of the SPI recorded for SIS. And we found that, for instance, they had a problem for the red zone here is where you don't like to be. And they had a problem for minimal equipment list. And for those, we suggested that unless they map out the antecedents or the possible issues connected to the process or activity that normally is there to fix minimum equipment list and keep them under check, it was impossible for the company to actually do an initiative that would be very consistent with their performance management scheme. As we said before, there are many different types of data that are collected to go into this KPI. But the main issue is in being systemic, not just in collecting as much data as possible, but in making sense of the data. So that you need to collect the part that gives you, that is capable of giving you the right indication on what to do and how effective it has been, what you have been trying to do. So the objective is to construct and constantly update a synthetic picture of the system risk from multiple sources of data that might be already available in the company, and then organize the data in a way that will be able to prioritize policies and programs for change or give indication about the most urgent needs. The second example, if we still have time, is about the case study that we did for a small regional airport in Italy. So let's say the problem they were facing at the time we met them was the fact that they had to grow, and they had to grow fast, otherwise there were going to be cuts from the government and therefore the funding from them to keep on their operations. But when they had to grow, they discovered that they had a problem in the capability for performance management at the time. Problems were related around the area of the fact that most of the required data was self-monitoring, mainly through periodic survey. Most of the tools they were using were paper-based. Very few electronic tools were there to allow data monitoring to take them to the next level. And performance management was really not embedded in the routine operation. So they tended to do things, but it was very difficult to take stock of what they were doing and how they were doing it in a way that would enable them to improve, to grow. So to meet the target, they need to have a standard base for performance management. They also had a cultural barrier in place. So they had a lack of trust historically within the company. So it was difficult to put a performance management context in a situation where people might have a fear of being monitored themselves, of their action being recorded, or their safety concerns being, in a way being used against them. So we had to take a very proactive attitude to involve them, to have a participatory approach, like the aspect of ISO 31000 that we talked about, consultation. It was really critical in this context, in the sense of allowing people to make sense of what they do currently and how what they do is useful for the company and how it can be used to embed in a better framework for everyone involved, so able to relinquish some benefit to them as well. So the first step, if you remember the performance management framework in MASCA, there are 3 steps: how it works, what it do, and how to change. The first step was to model all the different activities that the company were doing and addressing basically with them in interviewing the main people responsible for doing those activities, so then we could help them to map them out. We found a picture that it was slightly different from the operation manual that the company has, and which is often the case in many of the organizations we've been visiting. In understanding that, what is it doing in the sense of being able to actually do the risk assessment of those activities and how it could be supported better, we use a user-centered design for a new tool, first and foremost, to collect the data for their day-to-day operation, which is around the core activities, back to basic, around the turnaround process of an aircraft arrival and departure at the airport itself. So it was paper-based before, and now we have the opportunity to give them a tool to collect it electronically, and by doing so, we can integrate in that core data also the information regarding the issue and the threats managed day by day, from one ship to the next in relation to safety and risk. So that's exactly what we follow. At the same time, because of the issue of providing them with a framework for safety management system, we also were able to use their process map and provide them with a further tool that were able to follow all the activities and give them a systematic assessment for every task of all the possible categories of antecedents and all the to enable them to do the proactive hazard identification that we talked about. So we developed a risk matrix for them, which is not big deal, as most of you might know, but it's basically an application of the risk definition that we saw at the very beginning of this seminar in a very feasible manner, in a manner that can be applied even for a small company without a huge effort for quantification or for formal methodologies. So basically, we were able to map out all the activities, and for all the activities that they were carrying out, they were able to systematically identify each activity one by one, identify for each of them their antecedents, their consequences, the type of control measure they had in place, and assess the risk for each one of those scenarios, providing them with the fundamentals of building a risk registry. Not only that, the risk registry can be updated every day through their daily journal, because through the daily journal they collect the information from shift handovers on issue and threats that are managed day by day, and with a very apologies, with a very high level risk index for those threats that are being managed. And the same applies to the turnaround process. So for each one of those flights, they have to complete a checklist every day, every flight. So this is an enormous source of information and can be used, especially when the classification scheme is based on the same task, to update the risk registry that we previously saw. So in that context, the performance management for SAGA led to a better data gathering tools and a better way of participatory approaches within the company that led to a benefit to each individual involved, because the tool is something they currently use, is for their benefits, because basically switching from paper-based to this meant less workload for them and meant a better way of organizing their work. And what we reported, where the feedback we collected from them, was that we also noticed an improvement of performance in the sense that they were more focused, they had more clear what was expected for them for each turnaround. So everyone was more tuned towards the back to basic. What are the steps for the back to basic, and what are the main tasks they had to carry out, and what are the risks involved in those tasks, because they were on the front line of identifying those. What is still missing and what are the next steps for us is to follow up on the evaluation of the effectiveness of the recommendation that follow the risks identified through that process, because this is in its infancy. So it's a process that I just started. They have periodic safety meetings and identified possible improvements. Because it's at the very beginning, an evaluation of those improvements has not taken place yet. So what we got as a feedback, this is a sentence we collected from one of the main people involved in the initiative, is that the regional that we developed for them was a chance to obtain a real picture of routine operation, but this tool gave them the potentiality to identify latent issues of hazards in equipment, in procedure, in human factors issue in their daily activities. So this is exactly fulfilling the task that we previously saw of one of the navigation aids proposed by ICAO in terms of predictive approaches. That they're more than proactive in the sense that they try and anticipate hazards before they come into the picture. So in the MASCA performance management framework for risk, we are currently aiming at developing a tool that we actually close the loop by being able to provide process mapping, hazard analysis, reporting, the checking against control limit and KPI, the periodic review of the actions, and the checking of, the periodic review of analysis, so the periodic audits and all the other reporting input that can come into the picture for updating the risk registry, and the action part of the recommendation and evaluation of those. So I'm reaching the final slide of my presentation, where it was the final slide was really a report of how the company perceived the main advantage of that we actually previously stated. And I invite any of you that has any question to please openly pose it, because it can be a chance for everyone to clarify things that have been gliding over, etc.
Thanks, Chiara. Thank you very much. Chiara's had a number of technological problems this morning, has had to move office. Things are a bit crazy here this morning, but that was brilliant. Thanks very much. Any questions? No questions this morning? I just have one question. Chiara, you were highlighting the importance of evaluation and how it needs to be an inherent part of performance management. And I suppose the evaluation is the one aspect that researchers struggle with, and probably industry. Just in terms of any advice, in terms of the SAGA case study in particular, how you go about evaluating what's been done so far and future plans.
Okay. As I actually said, in terms of the SAGA case, the evaluation part is it's really in its infancy. But however, the main problem would probably be for even for bigger company, where the large amount of budget or even efforts being put into safety seems to go, well, it's controlled but quite uncontrolled in many other ways. So in the sense that you might be assigned a budget to carry out a safety recommendation, but very seldomly you get a report on how effective that recommendation has been effective in the sense of actually either whatever was the scope of it, preventing the accident from recurring again, or preventing those antecedents from being there, or being mitigated in the sense of preventing the seriousness of that scenario from reoccurring. So these are data that can be monitored. So effectively, while we monitor safety performance indicators on issue that we do not want to occur, we seldomly monitor then back those safety performance indicators to evaluate how effective such an action has been in actually reducing in terms of likelihood of severity. So our suggestion in those terms is just that the data might be there, and it's possible to set an evaluation period for any corrective actions, and then following that, within that evaluation period, actually observe how well our action has been carried out, and how effective the action also have been in its objectives. and it's something that over time will, if recorded, will save us from repeating the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah.
Which is, for very safety-conscious industry would be part of their continuous improvement. Something that can be done, but is seldomly done.
Great. Thanks, Chiara. Thank you. Any other questions? Not this morning. And I know Phil Davies from Bain Simmons and Vangelis, a few people had problems with the link for the GoToMeeting this morning. I'm not sure they couldn't log in. But this webinar was recorded, so we'll send you the link to the recording. I'll send everyone the link to the recording after the session.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, and sorry if I've been boring you with this introduction. If anyone has any questions, you can contact me at my email address. Okay, all the best for now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.